The wait for the Nintendo Switch to reveal has become exasperating for many. And perhaps that's somewhat why whenever we see a new rumor or potential leak circulate about this console, many shirk them off, even when there appears to be some level of credence or corroboration. But with these most recent Nintendo-related leaks, when I think you take a closer look and you consider all of the different factors, there's actually a lot here that is pretty compelling that I do think gives us some very good indication about the console, what it's about, and perhaps more than a lot of you may be thinking. So that's what we're getting into today on AndresRestart. And now here is a brief message about today's sponsor. Snaxy is the ultimate Android gaming mobile app where you can earn incredible rewards from over 100,000 options while playing your favorite mobile games. And it also helps publishers acquire new users. Every gaming session with Snaxy is rewarding, with over 100,000 items like gift cards, game skins, and in-game coins. Integrate Snaxy into your routine for non-stop gaming, personalized recommendations, generous rewards, and frequent content updates. For more on the Snaxy app, check out the link in the description below. Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and let's jump right into things. So there are two different leaks that have happened that are leading to more implications on other things. So the first one we're going to cover here has to do with the giant Pokemon Giga Leak. Now we've already talked about from the Giga Leak how there is this code name for Nintendo Switch 2, Ounce. But that's not what we're talking about today. Something even newer has surfaced, and at first glance, you might think, oh, this is just about Switch 1, but when you start to think about it a little bit more, it starts to get very, very curious. So I'm gonna have to blur out some of the imagery here because, well, this is a leak of a Pokemon project that may still see the light of day. It's codenamed Rodeo, or perhaps that project was cancelled, and then there was a bit of a shift and was start up again as Project Synapse. So I'm treading lightly here. The actual concept art, even the footage we've seen on this, I'll have a link in the description below if you want to see more information if it's still out there, is very, very interesting. But there's some information that came with this Pokemon leak that shows an actual document of how the controls would work for this game. And what's interesting about this internal documentation is that it shows a Switch controller. This is being talked about being in development for the Nintendo Switch and also mobile. So it's kind of like something similar to Pokemon Unite, but still entirely different, and it looks a lot cooler. But the point is, this document shows the Switch UI, but also shows colored buttons. Yep, we're going back to it, the colored button theory. This seems to be fueling that theory. So for those who are unfamiliar, the basic idea is that throughout the entire Switch era, at least for like the first 6 years, there were no instances of any kind of colored buttons in any sort of the UIs for any Switch games. But starting in 2023, we started to see some third-party games have colored buttons. And what was weird about this is that some of these third-party games would be on PlayStation and wouldn't have the colored buttons. But what made this even weirder is it wasn't just the occasional third-party game, but also a couple first-party games. We saw it in Super Mario RPG and Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. Of course, we still haven't seen any official reveal about the Switch 2 yet, nothing's been proven about this theory, and some have speculated that perhaps the reason why we've seen the colored buttons is simply because this is a new stance they're taking for the Mario RPG games, and not so much a hint towards colored buttons being for Switch 2. And some even wonder why it would even make sense to add colored buttons. Well, think about it. If we're getting a direct sequel to the Switch, where the Switch 2 is going to look a lot like the Switch, be very similar, just improved upon, then Nintendo's likely going to want to think of ways to help the console stand apart from its predecessor. And one way to do that is by changing how the buttons look. So if they're essentially the same, if you change the colors, that will help it to stand out. But there's also a practical reason to go back to colored buttons, because this is something Nintendo's done in the past. They did it with Super Famicom, and they've also done it with new Nintendo 3DS. And the reason why it makes sense for a practical reason is because when you're offering tutorials for different games, it's a lot easier to identify what color is on the controller as opposed to the letter. Whenever I share controllers with people who are unfamiliar with games, they always get confused, but if you say, oh, it's the red button, oh, it's the yellow button, they can more quickly identify which button to press. But why are we seeing some Switch games with colored buttons? This would be for Switch too. Well, the thinking is that there is still going to be a lot of crossover between Switch 1 and Switch 2, as we've actually seen indicated by the Pokémon leak. And because of this, there are a lot of games that were developed with Switch 2 in mind for some time now, and with the select few games we have seen that have colored buttons, those are just a few that have trickled out where they decided not to really change the UI back to just the normal basic UI we've seen for most Switch games. But going back to this recent Pokémon leak that shows colored buttons, what's weird about this though, and how it doesn't quite match up, is that the orientation for the colored buttons is not the same as Super Famicom, or how we've seen it in prior games, including Super Mario RPG and Thousand Year Door. A is still for the red button, and Y is still for the green button. But the blue and yellow buttons, B and X, in terms of color, have been swapped. And some might bring up Mario and Luigi Brothership, another Mario RPG game that does use colors for its buttons. However, it is a little different. We have seen that they have used the B button with the blue color, which might lead you to think that perhaps Brothership is more closely matching up to these colored buttons we're seeing from this Pokemon leak. Maybe they're going with a slightly different color orientation this time around. However, upon closer inspection with Brothership, what you'll notice is that during the action sequences when you're picking moves specifically for Mario, or moves specifically for Luigi, the A button will be red, the B button will be green. Red for Mario, green for Luigi. And the reason why we've seen B as also blue before is because there are also instances where it's not necessarily an action move specific to just Luigi or Mario, where they just go for a blanket blue for most of the buttons. And so that's why we've seen that, and it's not necessarily an indicator of colored buttons. However, I think where things get interesting here is that we're seeing a Nintendo game that has colored buttons that is not a Mario RPG game. Yes, the orientation is a bit different, but this is not something we see in really games in general throughout the Switch except for the last couple years. So I still find it highly curious, and I do think it could be an indicator that, yeah, the Switch 2 may have colored buttons, in part because it's easier for players to identify which button is which, but also to help set itself apart from the Switch 1. Now you still might be left wondering why they even would have bothered to change the color orientation. One thing I'd like to note is that this is a leak from a game that is not happening anymore or has changed. So it's from a while back, and so plans could have changed. But if I were to guess the logic behind changing the orientation of the color, either A, it's just a mistake, or B, they thought maybe that A and B would be the more primary buttons, X and Y would be the more secondary buttons in most cases, and that red and blue are a better pair of primary colors than red and yellow. I personally think this actually makes some sense. Of course, we'll see how things actually pan out. But we're just getting started here. There's an even bigger leak that has even more implications. So if you have gotten to this point in the video, I'd like to say thank you for watching all this time, and if you do enjoy my content, to please subscribe and hit that notification bell. So with this next potential leak, a lot of people have found it to be quite laughable, mocking it, not taking it seriously. Why? Well, here it is. We see here on Family Boards, Ninspider has posted this mock-up image, and they say, just kid drawing something. And what we see is a very rudimentary little doodle of a dock with a very fat, rounded backside, and also the Switch tablet with what appears to be a U-like kickstand, and also we can see the oval-like shape that would fit the magnetic attachments for the supposed Switch 2 Joy-Con controller. Now, while some are not taking this seriously because it's just a random doodle, seemingly, I think upon closer inspection, when you actually take the time to pay attention and look at all the details, there's some serious meat behind this leak. So for those who are unfamiliar with Ninspider, they aren't someone who posts very much on family boards, but the times they do post, it's been about Switch 2. They've talked about how the Switch 2 would have a rounder dock, a rounder charger, and rounder controllers. And with this recent doodle, they are showing off this more rounded dock with this really weird rounded backside that is bigger than the Switch 1 dock. And we haven't seen anything about a rounded charger yet. However, we did also recently get the prototype leak of the Switch 2, where we've seen actual imagery. Multiple sources have indicated that it lines up with what they've heard, including even Video Games Chronicle. And from what's been seen in this prototype, the Joy-Cons are rounder, just as Ninspider suggested. Now, something else that Ninspider has suggested is that there would be 2 new buttons, and from what we've seen of the prototype, there's at least 1 new face button. And the Joy-Cons do seem to have a bigger button on the underside that, in my opinion, is just a button to disengage the Joy-Cons from the Switch tablet, which technically we already have on the Joy-Cons for Switch 1, they're just smaller and not the same shape. So perhaps that's what they were referring to, or maybe there's something else. But another very interesting potential leak from Ninspider that has led people to believe that whatever Ninspider posts is legitimate and that their name is a combination of Nintendo and Insider is that they were the first to indicate magnets for Nintendo Switch 2. They started talking about it in mid-April, and it wasn't until later in April of this year that we saw the Vandal report and also the MobaPad leaks indicating that the Joy-Cons for Switch 2 would be connecting magnetically. So points to be made by all this is that Ninspider has a little bit of a history of leaking Switch 2 details, and other stories and reports have corroborated their information. And it isn't really that far-fetched to think that we would see a doodle about Switch 2 like this, because guess what? This happened for Switch 1 as well. Back in 2016, a doodle came out that showed off the NX dev kit, the tablet-like controller with the Joy-Cons, and even like a dock. At the time it was referred to as the NX, but we learned later that the NX is the Nintendo Switch. And we've even also heard that Nate the Hate has somewhat semi-corroborated this story. Now, the reason you might be seeing people say that he somewhat corroborated the story on Twitter or Reddit or places like that is because he essentially said that he heard something similar, but he can't fully verify it. So it's just another person that heard something in there that perhaps may add just a little bit more to the believability of this leak. But why is this leak a big deal? Sure, okay, let's just say we can believe this doodle based off everything we just discussed, all the corroboration and support, and the other bits of leaks from beforehand from the same source seemingly being right. Well, there's 2 huge implications here. First, let's talk about the dock, and then we'll talk about the kickstand because I think it actually means a lot more. So specifically with the dock, we've seen shipment data that supposedly there will be a higher wattage AC adapter and also an additional cooling fan. In other words, not just 1, but 2 cooling fans for the Nintendo Switch 2. And it's been speculated that perhaps that additional fan would be in the dock. And now we're seeing a doodle of the dock where it's clearly larger, perhaps indicating that there's more to what's inside of here. If this dock is going to be using a higher wattage AC adapter, there may need to be some more size for that, and they may also want to have another fan in there if they're going to be taking advantage of this higher wattage to have even higher clock speeds to produce even better visuals in docked mode. And so we've discussed this in the past, how the Switch already has 2 different modes. It has handheld mode and docked mode, and in docked mode, because it's connected to an external power source, there is no need to be worried about power consumption to drain the battery so they can output better visuals for TV mode. And so the thinking is that with Switch 2, this feature would be further maximized, the improvement in TV mode. And in order to do that, you raise the wattage, but you also account for the higher clock speeds by adding additional cooling. And that's what this bigger dock with the rounded backside may be facilitating. So things are matching up here. But let's now get to this very interesting kickstand that we're seeing. So the reason why this kickstand is interesting is because it takes us back to a rumor right before the prototype leak. There was another supposed Chinese leak where supposedly there was indication of their work and there were a variety of things discussed. But what was discussed also included a U-shaped kickstand just like this. And so some of the speculation was that perhaps this kickstand would be a bit sturdier, maybe made out of metal, so it's strong, not flimsy, but also possibly it could double as a grip or a handle and not just a really nice kickstand. And that alone to me is personally exciting. I love the idea of it. Having a better kickstand for a Switch 2 that has a bigger screen would definitely make tabletop mode a much better experience, but then also it possibly doubling as a handle would remind me of the GameCube days, which I think would be cool. That is just speculation, by the way, but also considering that the dock has a rounded back edge, taking on more of an odd shape, it is kind of reminding me of the Nintendo GameCube. Is the Nintendo Switch 2 actually the Nintendo Game Sphere? Probably not, I'm just kind of joking here, but I do find it interesting. But the more interesting implication by this is that because we've had another potential leak talking about this U kickstand, I now take another look at that leak. And that leak also mentioned that the backside of the tablet just straight up says Nintendo Switch 2. It has a Switch with a 2 logo, essentially, something like that. In other words, this console would indeed be called the Nintendo Switch 2. Which brings us back to a recent story we discussed that a lot of people were not a fan of, but to be honest with you, I totally stand by it. And that's a story where we talked about how an insider is seemingly teasing the Nintendo Switch 2. And yes, I'm referring to industry analyst Dr. Serkan Toto. So a few days ago, Dr. Serkan Toto just posted on Twitter, in quotes, Nintendo Switch 2. That's all the tweet is. However, if you take the time to look throughout their entire history of tweets, you'll notice that this is extremely out of the ordinary. This does not match their tweeting pattern whatsoever. There is no other tweets that or look anything like this. They don't just tweet random words. They usually have significant information to convey, or it's in response to someone else. So it's very out of character, unless you consider the other two documented cases where he has deleted tweets. These being Z2 2022, which was a quote tweet of Nintendo announcing a Direct well in advance, which 13 days later in that Nintendo Direct we did see Z2 2022, Breath of the Wild 2, a trailer with a 2022 release date. The game was later delayed to 2023, but Mr. Toto teased us on that information and then deleted the tweet. And then again, in 2023 recently, towards the end of the year where it really made no sense to have a Zelda remaster or remake revealed in October, he tweeted ZR 2023, and then 9 days later, we got the announcement or the reveal of the Zelda live-action movie. And this is the only times we've seen Dr. Serkan Toto make tweets like this. Think about it. Whenever something like this happens, there are a whole bunch of reports, YouTube videos talking about it. So it's well documented. This isn't like he tweets random things all the time and we're just picking the times that seem to make sense. No, the only instances weird things like this have happened, something materialized within 2 weeks. And here we have this interesting tweet that just has Switch 2 in quotes. My personal thought on it is that it means two things. One, we're going to get news relatively soon, presumably before Nintendo's shareholder meeting on November 5th. And two, that the name is Switch 2, which is seemingly supported by this recent doodle with the kickstand and the fat dock, and also that Chinese leak from about a month or so ago. And so when you pull all these different things together, the Switch 2 with these rounder Joy-Cons that have magnetic attachments that are bigger, a bigger 8-inch screen, a new thinner kickstand, a fatter, rounder dock, potentially color buttons. All this together would suggest that the console looks very different from the Switch 1. It would set itself apart, and if they brand it clearly as the Switch 2 with a very obvious 2 on the back of the console, Nintendo would be very much avoiding the situation they had during the transition from Wii to Wii U, where many thought the Wii U was just an expansion or peripheral to the Wii. This time, from everything we're hearing and seeing, if this all pans out to be true, it's very obviously a sequel to Switch 1. But what do you all think? What do you make of all this information and how it all connects? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.